Here we are again, and in today's episode, we will discuss the international history of labor movement. The origins of labor movement lay in the formative years of the American nation, when the free wage labor market emerged in the artisan trades late in the colonial period. The earliest recorded strike occurred in 1768 in the New York journeyman tailors protested a wage reduction. The formation of the Federal Society of Journeyman Cordwainers in Philadelphia in 1794 marks the beginning of sustained trade union organization among American workers. From that time on, local craft unions proliferated in the cities, publishing lists of prices for their work, defending their trades against diluted and cheap labor, and increasingly demanding a shorter workday. First, with the formation in 1827 of the Mechanics' Union of Trade Associations in Philadelphia, central labor bodies began uniting craft unions within a single city, and then, with the creation of International Typographical Union in 1852, national unions began bringing together local unions of the same trade from across United States and Canada. In the 19th century, trade unionism was mainly a movement of skilled workers rather than industrial workers. The early labor unions harbored a conception of the just society, deriving from the Republican ideals of the American Revolution, which fostered social equality, celebrated honest labor, and relied on the independent virtuous citizenship. The transforming economic changes of industrial capitalism ran counter to labor's vision. The result, as early labor leaders saw it, was to raise up two distinct classes, the rich and the poor. The advocates of equal rights mounted a series of reform efforts that spanned the 19th century. Most notable were the National Labor Union, launched in 1866, and the Knights of Labor in the mid-1880s. These labor reform movements might have seemed at odds with trade unionism, aiming for a cooperative commonwealth rather than a higher wage, appealing broadly to all producers rather than strictly to wage workers, and avoiding trade union reliance on the strike and boycott. However, there is no contradiction. Trade unionism tended to the workers' immediate needs, while labor reform to their higher hopes. The two were held to be strands of a single movement, rooted in common working class constituency. However, during the 1880s, that division fatally eroded. Despite its labor reform rhetoric, the Knights of Labor attracted large numbers of workers hoping to improve their intermediate conditions. The Knights carried on strikes and organized along industrial lines that threatened national trade unions demanded that the group confine itself to its professed labor reform purposes. When it refused, they joined in December 1886 to form the American Federation of Labor, or AFL. As industrialism matured, labor reform lost its meaning. The founders of the AFL translated this notion into the principle of pure and simple unionism. Only by self-organization along occupy lines and by a concentration of job-conscious goals would the worker be furnished with the weapons which shall secure his industrial emancipation. The AFL asserted as a formal policy that it represented all workers, respective of their skill, their race, their religion, their nationality, or their gender. But the national unions that had created the AFL, in fact, comprised only the skilled trades. Today, AFL-CIO is the Democratic Voluntary Federation of 57 national and international labor unions that represent 12.5 million working men and women. So that's it for today's video. I hope you learned in this video. Don't forget to click the like and subscribe button down below.
The local history of labor movement. The Philippine labor movement is a social movement of workers and farmers led by middle-class ilustrados and socialist intellectuals. The labor movement is composed of labor organizations like trade unions, farmers associations, cooperatives, and other sectoral and people's organizations, often called non government organizations. The trade union movement while comprising only about 10% of the labor force, is the most organized and active component of the labor movement. The leaders of the trade union movement, together with the intelligentsia, formed the middle class, and the revolutionary intellectuals are the national leaders of the labor movement. The father of the Philippine labor movement is Don Isabelo de los Reyes. He unified the movement in 1902 under the First Labor Federation, the Union Obrera Democrática, despite the continuing repression under the American colonial regime. The organization of UOD by de los Reyes, Dominador Gomez, Lope K. Santos, and Hermenegildo Cruz led to the creation of the Bureau of Labor in 1908, which recognized labor organizations. The labor movement then became part of the independence movement. By 1930s, the socialist labor movement was firmly established with the Partido Komunista ng Pilipinas, or the Communist Party of the Philippines, of Crisanto Evangelista of UOD, and the Socialist Party of the Philippines of Pedro Abad Santos, a Katipunero Ilustrado leader captured by the Americans. The PKP and SPP merged during the war against the Japanese under the leadership of Vicente Lava and Pedro Abad Santos, and resurfaced later as the Congress of Labor Organization after the war led by Amada V. Hernandez, Guillermo Copacosha, and Mariano Balgos. The post-war era in 1953 featured communist repression and the period of collective bargaining. After the disbandment of CLO and the arrests of their leaders, non-communist labor organizations were organized under the Industrial Peace Act. Among these new federations were the Philippine Association of Free Labor Unions of Cipriano Cid, Federation of Free Workers of Wantan, National Confederation of Trade Unions, and the Philippine Trade Union Councils. There was a resurgence of the communist underground movement with the establishment of a new Communist Party of the Philippines in the 1970s under Jose Maria Sison. This led to the declaration of martial law in 1972 and later the enactment of the Labor Code of the Philippines in 1974. The Trade Union Congress of the Philippines became the labor center to represent labor in the tripartite system of labor relations in the country under the period of labor oppression. Outside of TUCP, however, Kilosang Mayo Uno was organized in 1980 by Felixberto Olalia, Cipriano Malonzo, and Crispin Beltran. In 1986, during the post-martial war period, more progressive groups within TUCP joined a new labor center initiated by the Aquino administration called the Labor Advisory Consultative Council, which included the Kilosang Mayo Uno. KMU later established itself as a labor center in 1988. Other groups like Lakas Manggagawa Labor Center and the National Confederation of Labor in the Philippines, which included the Bukluran ng Manggagawang Pilipino, also followed suit.
The history of International Labor Organization. The International Labor Organization was created in 1919 by Part 13 of the Versailles Peace Treaty, ending World War I. It grew out of 19th century labor and social movements, which culminated in widespread demands for social justice and higher living standards for the world's working people. In 1946, after the demise of the League of Nations, the ILO became the first specialized agency associated with the United Nations. The original membership of 45 countries in 1919 has grown to 121 in 1971. The constitution of the ILO was drafted in early 1919 by the Labor Commission, chaired by Samuel Gompers, head of the American Federation of Labor in the United States. It was composed of representatives from 9 countries including Belgium, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, France, Italy, Japan, Poland, and the United Kingdom and the United States. The driving forces for the ILO's creation arose from security, humanitarian, political, and economic considerations. The founders of the ILO recognized the importance of social justice in securing peace against a background of the exploitation of workers in the industrializing nations of that time. The ILO moved to Geneva in the summer of 1920 with Francis Albert Thomas as its first director. 9 international labor conventions and 10 recommendations were adopted in less than 2 years. These standards covered key issues including hours of work, unemployment, maternity protection, night work for women, minimum wage, and night work for young persons. The objective of ILO. The ILO has 4 principal strategic objectives. First is to promote and realize standards and fundamental principles and rights at work. Second is to create greater opportunities for women and men to secure decent employment. Next is to enhance the coverage and effectiveness of social protection for all. And lastly, to strengthen the tripartism and social dialogue. As for the ILO structure, the ILO is composed of 3 organs: the General Conference of Representatives of Member States, the International Labor Conference, the governing body, and the International Labor Office. The conference and the governing body are composed half of government representatives and half of representatives of employers and workers of members of state. The presence and voting power of these non-governmental elements give the ILO a unique perspective on the problems before it and offer possibilities for dealing with the practical problems facing ILO members. In structure, the ILO is unique among world organizations in that the representatives of the workers and of the employers have an equal voice with those of governments in formulating its policies. The annual International Labor Conference, the ILO Supreme Deliberative Body, is composed of 4 representatives from each member country, 2 government delegates, 1 worker, and 1 employer delegate, each of whom may speak and vote independently. Between conferences, the work of the ILO is guided by the governing body, comprising 24 government, 12 worker, and 12 employer members, plus 12 deputy members from each of these 3 groups. The International Labor Office in Geneva, Switzerland, is the organization's secretariat, operational headquarters, research center, and publishing house. Its operations are staffed at headquarters and around the world by more than 3,000 people of some 100 nationalities. Activities are decentralized to regional, area, and branch offices in over 40 countries.
I'm Martin Kayabyab and I will be discussing the national unions and federation in the Philippines. But before that, let's remember first what a legitimate labor organization is, which means a union or association of employees which exists in whole or in part for the purpose of collective bargaining of or dealing with employers concerning terms and conditions of employment and duly registered by the Department of Labor. So, all persons employed in commercial, industrial, agricultural enterprises, including employees of government and controlled corporations, can join labor unions and worker associations, as well as of those religious, charitable, medical, and educational institutions, whether operating for profit or not. So now, let's understand what a national union or federation is. So this refers to a group of legitimate labor unions in a private establishments organized for collective bargaining or for dealing with employers concerning terms and conditions of employment for their member unions or for participating in the formulation of social and employment policies, standards, and programs registered with the Bureau. So there are two types of union. We have the public sector and the private sector. So according to Article 234, the requirements of registration should be a federal, national union or industry or trade union center, and an independent union shall acquire legal personality and shall be entitled to the rights and privileges granted by law to legitimate labor organization upon issuance of the certificate of registration based on 5 requirements. So number 1, a 50 pesos registration fee, the name of its officer, addresses, the minutes of the organizational meetings, who participated in meeting, which will be the second requirement. The third, if an independent union, the names of all its members comprising at least 20% of all the employees in the bargaining union. And if it has been existent for 1 more years, the fourth requirement is an annual financial report. Lastly, 4 copies of Constitution and bylaws of the applicant union, minutes of its adoption or ratification. So on top of that, for federation and national unions, they are also required a proof of the affiliation of at least 10 local or chapters, each of which must be duly recognized collective bargaining agent in the establishment or industry in which it operates, supporting the registration of such applicant federation or national union. The names and addresses of the companies where the locals or chapters operate, and the list of all the members in each company involved. So according to the statistic of blr.dole.gov, in the first quarter of 2022, there are actually 116,175 labor organizations or 4.8 million workers membership. So 82.7 are from workers association, 15.7 are from private sector, and 1.6 are from public sector organizations. So now, what are the samples of these federations and unions? So some from our research, we have the Federation of Free Workers, FFW, in 1950 with 40,000 members. So this is a national trade union center in the Philippines, which was founded in the response to the growing oppression and marginalization of labor and exploitative social structure and arrangements. So we also have another sample, which is Kilusang Mayo Uno, a very popular one this May 1, 1980 established, which advocates for an across-the-board wage increase. Actually, they were the one who campaigned for the House Bill 435, approved 125 legislative wage hike. So they are also campaigning against extrajudicial killings, transport strike to protest rising oil prices, and a lot more. So, Sentro ng mga nagkakaisa at progresibong manggagawa or Sentro in 2013 with 80,000 members. So, these are also vowed to help strengthen an international workers' solidarity as it is decided in one of its resolutions to affiliate to the International Trade Union Confederation. So, another sample that we have is Trade Union Congress of the Philippines or TUCP in 1875 with 480,000 members. So, this federation saw the necessity and importance of uniting themselves into a strong and dynamic labor center. We also have ALWIS or Alliance of Workers in the Informal Economy sector in 2008 who are organizing nationally, formally, and formally bringing people together who collectively work toward empowerment and poverty alleviation. We also have Association Labor Unions in 1954 and AILER in 1981, and lastly PS Link in 1907. So you can research this on the internet if you want for more information. That's all. Thank you.